All right. Well, good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on where you are in the world, to everyone. My name is James Macklin. I'm the current chair of TDWG, and I'm joining you from what is a pretty cloudy day here in Ottawa, Canada. On behalf of the executive and the program committee of the Biodiversity Information Standards, or what we affectionately call TDWG, I'd like to officially welcome everyone to our first virtual conference. These are certainly challenging times in navigating a global pandemic, but we've come together and worked hard to make this event possible. Holly, if you could switch the slide. Thank you. We'd like to gratefully acknowledge the financial or in-kind support of TDWG 2020 from the following organizations: Pensoft Publishing, the JRS Biodiversity Foundation, the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, or GBIF, IDIG Bio in the United States, the Distributed System of Scientific Collections, or DISCO in Europe, and the Atlas of Living Australia, or ALA in Australia. Without them, this seemingly free event would certainly not have been possible. So thank you very much to our sponsors and supporters. Thanks to many of you that attended our one-week working session in September. I think we were very successful in moving standards development forward. It was a great pleasure to also see many new participants learning and engaging in the process. That was very heartening in this virtual environment. So we've developed an exciting program for you, beginning with today's keynote by Dr. Scott Edwards. We have 9 symposia, 3 panel discussions, 5 contributed oral sessions spread throughout the week and across 24 hours each day, as well as some virtual posters. On Thursday, we have a second keynote talk by Kenichi Ueda of iNaturalist, followed by the TDWG business meeting. And for those of you who are new to TDWG, you don't have to be a member to attend the TDWG business meeting. So all of you are welcome to come and learn a little bit more about the inner workings of TDWG if you're interested on Thursday. I think you can all appreciate the logistical challenge compiling and coordinating a schedule across 24 hours. And I'd certainly like to thank our volunteer schedulers who often referred to this as a complex game of spreadsheet Tetris, which I thought was very appropriate. Those of us who spent a lot of time playing Tetris in the past. There'll be 3 hosted social hours spread throughout the week on the first, second, and final day. Again, a little bit dependent on where you are in the world. I understand there'll be some great entertainment provided, so please feel free to join some or all of them. And of course, feel free to bring your own appropriate drinks and snacks. As you're likely now aware, we'll be using the dedicated Zoom web meeting for the week, as there'll be no overlapping sessions. So you really only have to worry about that one link. The web meeting format allows participants to use their microphones and cameras when appropriate. And we have trained volunteer moderators, technical support, and helpers to guide each session, supporting the speakers and those who wish to ask questions, either using the chat or the Google Docs that we provide. Now, I'd like to remind you that in registering, all of you agreed to abide by a code of conduct, and failure to respect it will lead to your removal from a particular session or potentially the conference itself. So please keep this in mind. When considering the schedule, please pay attention to the times of your sessions in your time zone. We've done our best to reflect those on the website scheduler and provide links to download for your calendar or your own personal calendar on your computer. So hopefully you make it to the sessions you want to make it to. However, all of the sessions are being recorded and posted to the TDWG YouTube channel. So within a few days, if you just can't stay awake for that one talk or session or fathom getting up that early in the morning, don't worry, we have you covered. Finally, I'd just like to say, enjoy the week. Please feel very welcome to engage and contribute, even if you're new to TDWG. As I often say to my son, there are no silly questions. And speaking of questions, are there any questions? You'd have to put them in the chat. I'll give you a quick second. I see lots of countries and cities going by. It's very exciting in the chat. Thank you for that. Okay, well, I don't see any questions floating by, so that's good. I hope I managed to say everything that needed to be said. So I'm also acting as the moderator for the first session for this keynote. And so when we moderate sessions, there's a little bit of background that we have to go through. So I'll do that now. So along with my colleagues, we have people here, as I mentioned above, doing technical support and also helping look through the questions, et cetera. So along with them, we have created a Google Doc, which we will paste into the chat. It's already been pasted once, but we'll put it in several times as people enter. And that will link you to that document. Thank you, Quentin. That allows you to put questions down. If you have questions for Scott or questions generally for us as well, that's fine. And we'll use those and try to answer them as best as we can. And so just a second reminder, as I mentioned above, remember the respect in this virtual environment and our code of conduct. So now it's my great pleasure to introduce our first keynote speaker, Dr. Scott Edwards. Scott's the Alexander Agassiz Professor of Organismal and Evolutionary Biology at Harvard University in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and also the Curator of Ornithology at Harvard's Museum of Comparative Zoology. And today he's going to give a talk called Bicycling, Birding, and #BLM, or Black Lives Matter, Across America in a Summer of Chaos. And as a little side note, funnily enough, I heard about Scott's trip early on via a Radio Canada blog, and then began to follow him. It's well known, of course, that Canadians love to keep up on US news of our colleagues south of the border. And I'm interested to see how many people also may have followed Scott in his journeys across America. And if you did, maybe put a exclamation mark in the chat. Let's see how many people knew that. Well, look, already lots going by there. Scott, you're popular. So with that said, it's my great pleasure to introduce Scott Edwards, and I'm really looking forward to his talk. Take it away, Scott.
Thank you, James. I appreciate that introduction, and I'm really excited to be at the meeting. I have not attended a TDWG meeting myself, but I've over the years been exposed to some of the initiatives of TDWG and some of the goals, and it's just a wonderful organization. And it's particularly nice, I think, at this event to not talk about science so much, but to reflect on what for me was a really extraordinary summer. And so without further ado, I'll just go ahead and share my screen. Let's see, can everyone see that okay? Great, looks good. I thought I would share with you my journey across the United States this summer on bicycle. This was a plan that I had been fermenting in my head for many years. I did a little bit of touring in college, but not much since then. And through a confluence of events and primarily just the COVID epidemic, all of my summer plans were canceled, and it just seemed like the best time to do it. And so before I begin, I just wanted to give a quick shout out to my colleague, Connie Rinaldo, who I think is one of the organizers of the meeting. Thank you, Connie, for encouraging me and all the great things you do. And I also just wanted to briefly mention this report, which I think most of you probably are aware of. It's the new biological collections report that I was very fortunate to work on. And I know that several of the other committee members are here at this meeting. And in particular, I just wanted to single out Andrew Bentley, who's at the University of Kansas Museum, who taught me more about biodiversity informatics through this committee than anyone could. It was a really wonderful committee to work with. I saw Barbara Thier's name pop up there. There's probably a bunch of committee members here, but it was a great learning experience for me. Okay, well, starting with the big picture, this is my route across the US, starting at Plum Island, Massachusetts on June 6th, and ending at Sunset Beach, Oregon on August 20th. And what I hope to do in the talk is to touch on a bunch of themes. Of course, the amazing natural history I encountered, and also just some of the impressions I had of the people and the landscapes and the history. Traveling by bicycle is really a great opportunity to slow down and to take some of those so-called blue highways made famous by this really great book by William Least Heat Moon. You probably have seen it, but it was mentioned to me at several points along my journey by people, and in many ways it does capture the spirit of a sort of meandering ride like this. My route was helped a lot by maps that were published by the Adventure Cycling Association, and basically I stitched together a bunch of their maps, and as well as using apps like Google Maps or Komoot to help me on my way. None of the maps that they published, of course, started at Plum Island, Massachusetts. That was just a convenient place for me to start. I should also say that, my decision to go east to west was primarily based on my family and just the situation. It seemed back in June much more prudent and frankly much more fun to start close to where I live in Concord, Mass, where I am now, than to fly to the West Coast and start from there. So I had the good fortune of having my wife and one of my daughters there with me for a send-off, as well as my brother, Mark. And so that was much, much more fun. Now, all of my colleagues, many of my colleagues said, "You're going the wrong way, Scott. You should go west to east. The tailwinds will be better for you." And all I can say is that they were wrong. Not only did I have as many tailwinds as I did headwinds, but for me, the unfolding drama of going east to west far surpassed any inconveniences presented by headwinds coming out of the west. When you go on a bike trip like this, you put your equipment together. This is my new Surly disc trucker bike, which really worked really well. Front and rear panniers, as well as a front bag. I'm carrying a tent, sleeping pad, sleeping bag. I had lots of bicycle parts and tools with me. I carried about 2 or 3 days worth of food with me. And in general, tried to be as self-sufficient as possible. Total weight of my bags was about 60 pounds. Most of the time I would camp, and I honestly just enjoyed the camping much more than I did staying in hotels. At many points I did end up staying in hotels, such as this little cabin in Canyon Ferry Lake, Montana, on in a campground area. But just I basically am fortunate enough to have done camping throughout my life and in my research even, and I think I prefer to stay in a tent even more than sleeping in my own bed. So tried to do that whenever possible. And of course, I would make sure there was a swimming pool at the other end. I was very serious about quizzing campgrounds whether they had a swimming pool or not. And when there wasn't a swimming pool, I was lucky to have rivers like the Madison River here in Montana, which was a great way to cool off at the end of the day. The elevational profile of my trip, you can see it captured many of the geological features that you see moving east to west. My first big hurdle were the Green Mountains of Vermont. And then I encountered this sort of lowlands, flatlands south of Lake Ontario going westward in New York. But in part because I chose to go to Ithaca, New York, I encountered lots of hills in central New York heading towards Ithaca. And then I hit the lowlands again at Lake Erie through western Pennsylvania. A big stretch of the middle was going through the Great Plains and the Prairie States. You can see it gradually increases in elevation, but it's so imperceptible, you don't even notice it. And my first real hills came from the Badlands National Park, that little blip there, and then the Black Hills in South Dakota, an offshoot of the Rocky Mountains. I had 3 major passes in Montana. I think my highest elevation was about 6,300 feet, which I should say is much, much lower than what I would have encountered had I gone straight west through Wyoming. I made an executive decision at one point to not cycle over the Bighorn Mountains, which is where my route was telling me to go, which would have given me a 10,000-foot pass, but rather to cycle around them and north into Montana. I ended in the Palouse in southeast Washington state, and remarkably, the 2 days of traveling there were among the hardest, not only because of the elevation and the gradients, which surprisingly were steeper and encompassed a higher elevational range than, despite its absolutely lower elevation than the Rockies, but the searing heat. Those were days where it was, high 90s, 100 degrees. So those were surprisingly some of my hardest days. Birds were, of course, a ubiquitous part of my trip. I am an ornithologist. I'm a curator of the bird collection at Harvard. And so my research focuses on birds. And although I didn't actually, of course, I had binoculars with me. And although I didn't actually birdwatch actively very often at all, just because of time constraints, I did hear lots of things and would, of course, see things flying over. Here are just a couple examples: an osprey in Montana. You might be able to hear it screeching there. Surprisingly skittish, even though they nest on these tall poles. Whenever I cycled up, they would get very upset. Here is a killdeer. You might see a little bird running there. It's flying across the road. Again, all these are taken with my iPhone, so not the greatest quality, but killdeer were absolutely ubiquitous throughout the whole trip. One of the birds that I really got to know well was this Upland Sandpiper. Upland Sandpipers are not widespread in Massachusetts, but throughout the Midwestern states, they were among the most common birds, whether on the side of a highway such as we are here, or throughout the agricultural regions throughout the cornfields. They've somehow managed to make a living in some of the most monotonous agricultural habitats we have. Much of my birding was done by ear, and here I am in South Dakota. You might hear some chipping sparrows in the background there, simply taking in the landscape as I was moving through it. And one of the most exciting moments was when I really saw truly my first Western bird, which were these Western flycatchers. Here you see 2 juvenile birds, presumably just playing and learning how to fly. Western kingbirds were really the first bird I encountered that really signified that I was moving west. I had a chance to take in some mammals as well. Here's some pronghorn. It was remarkable when I entered Badlands National Park. This, of course, is much further west. Immediately, a whole bunch of biodiversity showed its head. This is a white-tailed deer group. Heading into Badlands, the buffalo suddenly appeared, the prairie dog suddenly appeared. and the pronghorn suddenly appeared. It was really quite dramatic. Our bridges around the country are, of course, great havens for swallows. Literally by the thousands, they make their homes in many of the bridges spanning our rivers. Here we are crossing the Missouri River in South Dakota. Just a remarkable scene. Mostly these are cliff swallows. Some of the more dramatic species included sandhill cranes. You can see these two birds flying to the right underneath the mountains there. Really just capturing that Western spirit. And I also learned about new habitats such as the potholes of South Dakota. I had heard about potholes, but I'd never actually seen them. And they're remarkable reservoirs of biodiversity. These are white-faced ibises flying over this tiny little area that is otherwise surrounded by cornfields. And here we have a black tern, which is really characteristic of these pothole regions. Really, you know, someone on Twitter once quipped that we're lucky to have any of these potholes left because it'd be straightforward to fill them in to make more land for agriculture. And fortunately, many of them have been preserved. Now, sadly, many of the birds I encountered were actually dead on the side of the road. I literally passed thousands of dead birds, some of them still moving from having been hit by a car recently. I think many people driving in cars don't even realize they've hit a bird. And so it's sort of a sad testimony to the toll taken on our highways. You can see these birds come from many different species. You know, the museum curator and me, of course, wanted to pick them up and put them in a collection, but of course I didn't have permits with me. But just a reminder that in addition to our buildings and windows, which of course act as huge mortuaries for birds, our highways are also extremely dangerous for birds. Now, rivers for me were really a great sort of landmark that kind of broke up the journey. And I could really mark my progress as I moved west. You can see some of the rivers I encountered in the eastern half of the state, of the country. It was just always a great moment of celebration when I hit a river. And of course, rivers comprise many of our state boundaries. And so that's another way in which I monitored my progress. Some of the rivers out west were just extraordinary, not only for their beauty, but for the history that they encountered. And so Little Bighorn, of course, is famous for the routing given by General Custer's army by the Native Americans there back in the 1850s. The Clearwater River in Idaho, one of the prettiest rivers I encountered, is of course world famous for its salmon fishing. And the Columbia River is just such a huge, of course, some of its width now is the result of having been dammed, but it's just an extraordinary sight, extraordinary landmark, especially when you feel so small as being on a bicycle. The Yellowstone River was perhaps my favorite river because I was able to follow it for almost a week as it went north and west through Montana. Here you can see just a snapshot of a camping site in Montana I had. Just take in the wonderful sounds of the water and just the panorama of this extraordinary river. It's actually the longest river, stretch of river that's undammed in the lower 48. There's over 600 miles of undammed river. So it's and of course this was a river that Lewis and Clark spent much time next to. Well, I'll mention just a bit. I was fortunate to encounter Native Americans in many different ways. I, of course, was cycling through many of their lands. and had a chance to interact with them in different ways. This gentleman in the top center was Native American in Indiana, and it was just so interesting to see his hobbies of, he was a plane builder. He would take old engines from cars that were broken down and put them into planes so they could fly. And he was one of these folks that really, he was a talker. I had to sort of pull myself away so I could make my, my goal for that day. But you can see the other Indian lands I passed through, and many uplifting indications of their ongoing struggles. For me, you know, it was a lot of optimistic moments, not only because people were incredibly generous along the way, but because there were indications that the US is still a magnet for talent and opportunity. Sangeet Lamachani was a postdoc in my lab at Harvard, and I was able to stay with him. And his story to me is so emblematic and so uplifting of the times. Sangeet hails from Nepal. Like many of us, presumably most of us, Sangeet is an immigrant. He lives in Streetsboro, Ohio, where you can see he is moved into this brand new development. You know, as much as I lament the habitat that's lost as a result of developments like this, it's also, for Sangeet, this was a dream. He was so proud of this house that he owned with his family. And the fact that he was able to, you know, establish a life, an exciting career for himself through hard work, for me, really captured the essence of my visit with him. And of course, in many of the towns I passed through, these were towns, many of which I hadn't heard of. There were lots of really uplifting signs of just trying to make their towns more welcoming. Here you see on the bottom some photos of an old schoolhouse that was very lovingly restored by the lady and gentleman that you see in the center bottom. This was a Lincoln era schoolhouse in the town of Winona, Illinois. And the welcome I received there, somehow it got wind that I was staying in the city park. And this lady literally walked up and gave me a little welcome bag and free coupons to the store. That's the kind of spirit that really made these small towns come alive. On the other hand, there were lots of places where it was clear that towns were on the brink. These are towns where essentially the only functioning habitation in the town is the local pub. And for example, the Food Mart in Odell, Illinois might look lively from the outside, but it was closed, presumably because there was a larger mart at a town farther away. Lots of essentially ghost towns, essentially with people still living in them. This was also reflected in the agricultural landscape, which I spent many, many days passing through. Now, it was extremely exciting to see the wind turbines all over the country, such as this one actually this should be Payne, Indiana. So these were always signs of hope, and frankly were very calming just to watch the turbines going round and round. But it was also the case that there was a lot of aging infrastructure out there. And so, for example, lots of grain silos that were outmoded, basically relics from a former era. Lots of coal trains, you can see in the lower center there, just packed with coal, particularly in Wyoming, and often heading west. And I would ask locals, where are these trains going? And most of them sort of jokingly said, oh, they're going to China. I'm not sure how true that is necessarily. And it's one of the things that I want to do is actually figure out where all this coal is going to, because it's, and of course, US history is totally bound up in our railway system. And the scale of that transport is really just staggering. By the same token, there were towns that were reliant on coal, which were lamenting the change of lifestyle that they can already feel. One lady in the town of Arvada, Wyoming, which you saw in the previous slide, was witnessing the changing fortunes of her community because coal, she sensed, was on the way out. I couldn't resist showing this slide, particularly for this audience of biologists. I took a 20-mile detour to visit the home of population geneticist Sewell Wright. Those of you, of course, who are evolutionary biologists will know Sewell Wright as one of the architects of the new synthesis back in the 1930s. It turns out, though, that Carl Sandburg is way more famous in Galesburg, Illinois. There are lots of towns, lots of signs pointing you to Carl Sandburg's house. Unfortunately, Sewell Wright isn't mentioned himself, just his father, Philip Green Wright, who helped Sandburg publish some of his poetry. Lewis and Clark, of course, formed the backdrop to a lot of my journeys in the second part of the trip. And it only drove home just how excruciatingly challenging their trip must have been, spending 2 years back in 1804, 1806 to head all the way to the West Coast from St. Louis. Lots of interesting depictions of Sacagawea, the Native American who is often accorded an important role in the success of the journey, but who I would probably argue was basically essential for their success in the way that she introduced them to and basically prevented lots of potentially violent interactions with local tribes. Even from the very beginning of my trip, I noticed lots of outpouring of political emotion. And of course, it was only a week or two before I started my journey that George Floyd had been shot in Minneapolis, and where Christian Cooper had been harassed essentially by while bird watching in Central Park. It was really the start of the Black Birders Week on Twitter, which finally pushed me over the edge to actually open a Twitter account. I had been one of these stalwart old fogies, sort of distancing myself from the social media platform. But Black Birders Week was something that I simply couldn't sit back and watch go by. I joined Twitter, and I was really pleasantly surprised how many people of color I saw out there trying to make their way in the biological sciences and ornithology in particular. And so these homemade signs that I saw were really touching in important ways, and ultimately convinced me to don some signage of my own. When I headed into Schenectady, New York, a lady with whom I was going to stay, I was organizing some homestays through a website called warmshowers.org, specifically for cyclists. She impressed me because not only was she going to welcome me into her home in this challenging time of the COVID epidemic, but she also asked me before I got there whether I was participating in Black Birders Week. And for me, the fact that a white lady would ask such a question was very intriguing because, you know, in all honesty, it had only been a week earlier that I had heard of Black Birders Week. And of course, many folks, whether birders or not, had never heard of Black Birders Week at all. So I texted Joan in Schenectady and said, look, can you make me some signs that will capture the spirit of the times? And she, I knew she was just someone that could get this done in 24 hours. In other words, I didn't want to extend my stay, but I really wanted these signs. And I ended up putting the grommets on in her living room. And the next thing you know, my bike was festooned with these signs. And it was a great way to add a new dimension to my trip, sparking conversations in many different contexts. I also stopped by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, and this was their take on these challenging times. Birds spark hope. I got lots of interesting questions from random people. What do you mean birds spark hope? I think those of us here can appreciate that even this very simple phrase captures the hope that we can find in nature, and I think conveys very well why we need to conserve it. The other sign, One Song, Many Voices, I donned as I crossed the Mississippi River appropriately on July 4th. It struck me as a really nice encapsulation of our country and the many different people that have come to play a part in it. I couldn't help but making fun of myself as I moved across the landscape. I was mostly spending my days alone in very isolated places, not seeing people for most of the day. And so I jokingly said that at least the cows might be listening to the Black Lives Matter signs on my bicycle. I think my trip can be summarized just through a series of encounters with extraordinary people. Most now, I will say, my political leanings don't correspond with all of the folks in this montage here, but to a person, they were overwhelmingly generous, and they would tell me that they were skeptical or even against the Black Lives Matter movement. At the same time, they would say, I don't care what color you are, I will treat you with respect. And it brought home just the challenges of where we all get our information from. I think many skeptics of the Black Lives Matter movement saw the images on TV of the violent interactions in Portland and other cities, and understandably perhaps began to identify the movement with that violence. I did what little I could to dissuade them, but this is the age-old problem of multiple sources of news and information. In fact, the couple on the lower right owned a store in downtown Portland, which actually had been looted as part of, in the wake of some of these protests. And I can't help but feeling sympathetic for them if their livelihood was being compromised in that violent way. Lenny up on the in the center right was one of the only Black African Americans that I had a conversation with during the entire journey. I mean, most of my route took me through rural areas where African Americans are extremely rare. Lenny was a card-carrying Democrat, and I asked him, how do you survive with surrounded by all these folks with other leanings? And he just looked at me and said, I know how to deal with them. Lenny was born in Walla Walla, Washington, and very interesting story growing up in that part of the country. I just wanted to end with a couple vignettes put to music. As you can imagine, traveling alone, music was a constant companion. And I tended to start the day with some mellow tunes. For much of the trip, towards the end, I would plug into something like Michelle Obama's podcast, which I would highly recommend to you. Here we have a stretch in Montana where I put on some tunes of old 70s folk singer who I'm sure most of you will know. I will say that my musical tastes essentially stopped evolving in about 1975, for better or worse.
something, what can it be?
That, of course, was the incomparable Joni Mitchell, who really kept me going in some challenging times. In the middle of the day, I would sort of ramp it up a bit. And here we are in the, towards the end of the trip in the rainforests of Central Oregon. Would get tough and the traffic was heavy, the cars were frequent, and the trucks were about to run me over. I would just fight fire with some good old rock and roll. There I am at Sunset Beach, Oregon, having finished my 3,800-mile journey. I got lots of advice before I left on my trip, and here are some of the best pieces of advice I got. First was to eat well. I think I ended up losing about 25 pounds, and yeah, I eat a lot more fruit now and nuts than I did before my trip. Not to focus on the endpoint. I really, that was a great piece of advice I got, just to take each day at a time. And surprisingly, you can imagine that I had to remind myself constantly just to enjoy myself. There was often so much tension to make it to the next point or to get over that next hill that I really had to remind myself of that. And here's my reading list upon my return. Just a lot of great impressions and a lot of interesting insight into our country at this point. But I feel fortunate to have been able to take this, this really extraordinary journey. And with that, I'd be happy to take any questions.
Well, thank you very much, Scott. That was great. That was a great tour. And I have to say, as a fellow cyclist, and I'm pretty jealous. It's always been something I've wanted to do, whether the American route or the Canadian route, I don't know, but they're both a little different, but very exciting. Now for questions, we have, for everyone out there, we have a couple ways we can do this. So you can put questions into the Google Doc that we have, and we can share those with Scott. Or if you have a question that you urgently want to ask yourself, because we're in the web meeting mode, you can raise your hand. I think you can see how to do that. Most of you are familiar with that. If you go into the participant and say, raise my hand, then you can ask your question in person, and we will broker that. We can turn your mic on. So I'll give people just a second to get organized there. If you raise your hand, you'll come, there's a lot of people here, so you'll come up to the top if you raise your hand, and we'll be able to see.
Let's see, James, do you want to like read me a question, or how do you want to do this?
We can do that. So one of the questions that came up early, Scott, was when you talked about the roadkill, and there was a comment that just being surprised that there was any permitting or anything that governed having to deal, if you wanted to take roadkill and put it in your collection or otherwise, and whether you, as in putting your curator hat on, can explain that to folks.
Yeah, I mean, most states have, they have permitting requirements, even for picking up roadkills. I mean, a resident of a state that finds a roadkill, I think, wouldn't get in trouble for bringing it to the local museum. But you know, if I were found with great horned owls in my pannier in a state where I wasn't permitted, that might lead to some problems. And yeah, certainly in other countries, you definitely need a specific permit for so-called salvage. If only we could just, you know, pick up stuff as we encountered it. But of course, that could lead to a lot of, you know, not so much trafficking, but just people harboring carcasses of endangered species. And I think the authorities would want to know about that.
Thanks. Here's an interesting one. So do you think you would have enjoyed it even more if you hadn't set yourself a challenging schedule?
I think so. I mean, yeah, maybe you're referring to the fact that I really had to get back to Harvard to begin teaching in the fall. And that was always looming in my mind and basically prevented me from exploring lots of little byways and stuff. Yeah, I think that, you know, that I think having that deadline did put a certain urgency on the trip. And, you know, basically I would try to do 50 or 60 miles a day. And I had sort of calculated roughly that if I could keep that up, I would make it in time to return to school in the fall. So yeah, that said, it would have been nice to have perhaps taken it a little more leisurely. On the other hand, too much leisure and, you know, the few times, I think I had about 4 layovers where I basically skipped a day of cycling. And boy, was it tough to get back on the road after those, you know, sleeping in a nice bed of maybe a friend of mine. And yeah, it was tough often to get started again. So basically after Iowa, I didn't have a single stay. I just kept going for the remainder of the trip.
I don't know, Scott, I think you didn't think outside the box enough in this COVID era. You could have done virtual classrooms from wherever you wanted along the road.
Good point, James. I mean, that said, I became an expert at doing Zoom meetings on a bicycle. You know, I would get into trouble occasionally trying to ask a question, although I would stop occasionally and type a question in. But you're absolutely right. It did cross my mind to just forget the return back east, just teach from Oregon. And I may try that in a future iteration.
Oh, sounds good. Okay, here you go. In interacting with the locals, did you get any new ideas or insights on biodiversity conservation on your trip? People's sense of biodiversity in their place.
Yeah, very good question. You know, most of my interactions with locals were not centered too much on biodiversity and more community kinds of projects. I was struck, there are a lot of, I ran into a couple arboreta actually in just places that, you know, they aren't on the map as having an arboretum, but even something as humble as the trees being labeled in a local park. That was another thing that distinguished Winona, Illinois, was in the city park, all the trees were labeled as species. And other small arboreta that just chanced upon. And that was really, really exciting. It'd be great to follow up and figure out who took the effort to put these together, because I did notice several of the ranchers that I spoke with were really, really proud of the biodiversity on their lands. And so, for example, those shots of the sandhill cranes and the pronghorn were both on a really large ranch outside of Sheridan, Wyoming. And, you know, ranchers are definitely passionate about the wildlife on their land. And of course, they resolve this challenge in different ways. But it was exciting to see that. And I think we'd all agree that private lands like ranches are a really, really important source of biodiversity in the country.
Interesting. Now, sort of in the era of fake news, did you encounter much anti-intellectualism? You know, do you have ideas for what we need to do there? How do we address this? How do we get the message to the people?
You know, I I usually waited until I had to tell folks that I was from Harvard, not because I, you know, expected any kind of backlash, but just because, you know, I am not someone to sort of wear the fact that I'm at Harvard on my sleeve. And actually, it was extremely refreshing occasionally when it was clear by the person's reaction that they had never heard of Harvard. Harvard for them was not some icon of, you know, intellectualism. And so I would say people were very intrigued that, you know, I was a bird biologist, and they liked that. There were a few times, maybe one or two times, where I could tell the person was visibly surprised that I was a professor at a major university. Of course, that sort of reaction, you know, sadly, I think is a regular occurrence, I would say, with people of color, and perhaps women. And so I don't think I did encounter clear evidence of fake news. You know, people claiming that the Black Lives Matter movement was being funded by the Democratic Party, that the coverage of the evolving epidemic was specifically to undermine Trump, and that in fact the epidemic was not increasing the death rate in the US. These kinds of things were definitely out there, and they would point to their sources, and you know, there isn't really much you can do when they're claim they're listening to someone with all the facts.
So, you know, you didn't say much about COVID and sort of the interaction with people and how they felt about, you know, distancing and things like that. So, I mean, you said you sort of were on your own a lot of the time. You camped, you stayed away. But when you did interact, were people like at distance? Did they seem to really think that this was a thing, or was it too early for that still?
Great question. You know, there is a map of mask wearing. I think the New York Times published it. And as you might expect, rates of mask wearing very much mirror the political affiliations of different counties and states. I actually had to delay the start of my trip at the beginning because many campgrounds weren't yet open, and they weren't allowing tenters such as myself to come and use their restroom facilities. They would only allow RVs. And that's why I had to start my trip basically staying with private citizens. I would always broach my request by saying, look, I'm happy just to camp in your backyard. I didn't feel comfortable just simply camping on the side of the road. I sort of feel that days like that are over, at least in the United States. And so I would always leave the option open of just simply camping in their backyard. Remarkably, you know, even in the in the Northeast, people were open to that, and with appropriate precautions, they were comfortable having me come into their house. I would say in many of the Western states, in fact, many of the states which now are actually experiencing an uptick in COVID infections, it was very, very cavalier, whether mask wearing or just socializing. And I will say that in many of the stores and areas run by Native Americans, they tended to take it much more seriously than the adjoining towns. And so, you know, you had to wear a mask in the store, and all of the store attendants were wearing masks, which simply wasn't the case in many smaller institutions out west.
I can understand. It's interesting. You touched on actually one of the other questions that came in. I'll just read it to you. Did you get in trouble for wild camping outside designated areas? So you sort of you made that clear that.
Yeah, the one day I tried to wing it and basically camp unannounced in someone's yard. I would of course ask the person. I would never camp in someone's yard without asking them. But that ended up being a big series of, oh, camp over there, camp a little farther down the road. And it ultimately ended up fine, but it was also quite grating how unwilling some folks were to let me camp in their yard. So that was a bit of a disappointment. And after that, I basically resolved to plan things at least a day ahead.
Great. So there's another question I'm going to ad lib it a bit for that Quentin asked, but he says, do you get a sense of how road verges are refuges for wildlife in some places? And I think, many of us think about the connectivity of habitat from place to place. And, when you lose that connectivity, you lose biodiversity. And so, I'm also curious, are those verges, are those strips, little lines of continuity? At least for birds.
Absolutely. In Ohio and Illinois and Indiana, you've got these forested breaks between agricultural fields. And when I cycled past them, I would hear all the usual suspects, red-eyed vireos, just lots of wood thrushes, lots of songbirds that wouldn't dare to spend a moment in the agricultural fields themselves. Other species like dickcissels or the upland sandpiper that I mentioned seem to be just fine in the actual monocultures. And so those, I think, very much like you here in England, the border, the areas that are so important for small birds, those little forest strips, I think, do play a really important role, especially in the Midwest.
Just adding to that, Zach Merle's just added, thoughts on use of herbicides versus mowing on roadsides?
Great question. I saw lots of signs, local signs by the owners of a property saying, don't mow here. They invariably had put bird houses up, for example, and they were telling the town officials, don't mow this strip because I want the grass to be long. I don't want to ruin the habitat for the birds nesting in these boxes. I have a great clip of a aerial sprayer, a plane that's basically spreading pesticides over a field, and I was shocked at one point in a campground. I think this was somewhere in, I think it was in Hardin, Montana. This fogger kind of came through the campground. It looked like it was spewing out, just smoke of death almost. I assume it was mosquito deterrent or something, but I sort of put my mask on for a moment just so I didn't have to inhale it. So, there is a lot of pesticides in use out there, unfortunately.
Yeah. Well, Scott, we've hit the hour, and we need to move on to the meeting itself and the content, and an exciting week. And on behalf of everybody here, I can't thank you enough. I think that was a fantastic talk. It really sets a tone and a stage for this week. And yeah, thanks again from all of us. Thank you so much. And I don't know, James, if you could save this wonderful chat. Thank you so much for these nice comments. This would keep me going in any dark day. You're so supportive. Thank you so much. Absolutely. We will save it. We always do. And we'll add it to that Google Doc. So it's always available, Scott. Great. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. And see you throughout the week.